let's take a pause and really think about that aspect that I was talking about, where data architecture is today, because we had this surprise realization a couple of years ago when Snowflake and Redshift and other commercial data warehouses started adding support for Apache Iceberg. What's going on there? Why are they doing that? And let's understand today in order to answer that question. So what's happening today, I think the central trend is that projects like Apache Iceberg, I would actually include Delta in this as well, have unlocked shared data warehouse storage. And this makes broad sense because this is exactly what we set out to do, just through a different lens. So I call this a happy accident. If you go and you fix ACID transactions, different engines and different components that are able to work with the same data at the same time, concurrently, safely, that's what we set out to do. In fact, that's the core of it. ACID transactions was the first thing that we started with. But it turns out that shared warehouse storage is a much bigger area and problem, because before we never had reliable shared storage. So this is actually kicking off an unprecedented architectural shift, where any data warehouse, rather than being the storage layer and the query layer sort of glued together, very tightly coupled, we can actually decouple warehouse storage and data, and start pulling this apart. So we've never really been able to do this reliably, and that's why this is a fundamental change, and is such a big change in architecture. And we really didn't see this coming until the big commercial data warehouses started looking at this area and adding support. The bigger shift, or the biggest shift here, is that in the past, when your storage and your compute are tied together very, very closely, it turns out that most workloads are won simply by where the data lives, because you can't have another data warehouse reach into the storage of your primary data warehouse and do just one workload and write back. So you have to basically run everything through the data warehouse or system where the data resides and where the data lives. So you might choose that based on what you need for some really high value BI application, or you might choose it based on the speed and ease of ad hoc queries going to ask questions that you need answers to right away. Whatever the criteria for choosing one of these systems, the rest of the workloads just sort of come along for the ride because the data is there, and you don't want to maintain two copies. You don't want to sync data across regions. You're very stuck using the system where the data resides. And that is the fundamental change that Iceberg unlocks. We don't need to do that anymore. And this is awkward, right? No database really wants to give up that advantage of having, winning workloads and getting pipelines and ETL and everything, like increasing that usage based on storage. So this is sort of a groundbreaking change in the industry. And it's going to be interesting to see just how things realign. I don't know about the business models, but I do know that despite this headwind of people not really wanting to, use data that is external and centralized, despite that headwind, centralization of data is a clear trend. And I think it's a clear trend for the exact same reasons that data warehousing was important in the first place. This is essentially delivering the next step on that journey of data warehousing, where you put all of your data in one place, you maintain it and everything can use the same thing. It's just that now we're going directly to the data instead of through a SQL layer. And when you have situations like acquisitions or other things, and you end up with two data warehouses, you actually have a clear path to combine them rather than trying to decide, well, do we move all the tables from the company A's data warehouse into company B's data warehouse, or vice versa? What do we do? Just keeping everything maintained in S3 or some other object store and bringing the engines to the data really makes a lot of sense. So I think that technologically, centralization is the biggest trend happening today. And that means that we have, I think, a realignment in how these systems are constructed. So data is becoming clearly centralized. Excuse me. As data becomes centralized, the compute components, like our sponsor Puppy Graph, can become more and more specialized because they don't have to worry about how data is being stored or garbage collection or any of the compaction operations or things like that. Engines can be really, really good at being just compute engines and focus on their problems. So we're going to see a lot of specialization unlocked in that layer because niche engines really don't need to go and implement a full security stack in order to be able to store and operate on data and things like that. So we're seeing both of these trends, both the centralization of data and other components and specialization of engines as they give up the data storage, maintenance, and security pieces of this space. So this, I think, is really where Iceberg is fitting into the ecosystem today. Iceberg is now, and this sort of puts, I think, a lot of what we're working on in the community into context. We're really working on standards for that centralized data layer. So in the last few years, we've introduced things like views. If you're going to have tables and you have this namespace of things that you can address as tables, well, that's where views live. So what we've done is we've gone and said, okay, we want to add views and a spec for views for at least any of the databases that support it. And we start small. We're starting with common views where you can store a single SQL string, and hopefully that works the same across all databases. Obviously, we know that that won't, and so we have the ability to store multiple SQL dialects and say Trino uses this SQL blob, Spark uses this SQL blob, and we're going to have the same results coming out. And eventually we'll get to an intermediate representation that you can translate to and from. And we'll also get to, I think, materialized views and all of those other constructs that are super valuable in the warehouse space. It just makes sense for them to be part of this centralized layer.